Great. I'm going to go ahead and call this meeting to order. Our legislative body just walked in. He's an attractive-looking body as well. So, and Councilman or Chairman Tinajero is out of state, so he won't be joining us. And I'm going to take a little. Well, why don't we ask and see if there's anybody from the public that requested to speak?
No members from the public present.
Great. Thank you. And do we need to have a roll call taken?
Councilmember Tinajero? Okay, and Councilmember Sarmiento?
Here.
And Councilmember Soloria?
Present. Okay. Great, we have a quorum. And so I'm just going to move along and go to agenda item number 3, because I know we have our advocates from Washington that have been waiting, and I know they have a time commitment as well, so there's some sensitivity. We'll take that one out of order. Dan and Leslie, are you both still on? Great. Why don't you guys go ahead and give your update? We're ready to go ahead and listen, and the floor is yours.
Hey, wonderful. Thank you so much, and thanks for having us again. A few different things happening in D.C., and of course you've got the written report in front of you, which has lots of details, so we won't go over it we won't read the report to you. But just to highlight a couple of things, I think most significant in September was the funding package that the temporary funding package that Congress was able to agree on, averting both a government shutdown and a debt ceiling crisis. They approved a continuing resolution, which essentially just keeps level funding from FY 2017 through December 8th. Government funding was set to expire on September 30th. It also raised the debt ceiling through December 8th, although the Treasury is going to be able to use extraordinary measures again to avoid a default until at least March 2018, and maybe even longer. Notably, the deal came as a real surprise, I think, to a number of folks, and sort of, I think, even the president's own folks. It came after a meeting with congressional leadership and got announced in very short order, and despite some concerns from House Speaker Paul Ryan, legislation got introduced that night, voted on the next day, and they pushed this whole thing through. It also included some hurricane relief funding. They will have to approve another hurricane funding measure in light of the disasters in Puerto Rico, Florida, and Texas. In the meantime, the work has continued on appropriation. The House has passed an omnibus spending measure at this point. In the Senate, they are continuing to work. Their bills have not hit the floor yet, but they are pushing them out of committee. And so we expect that, in December, we will have some kind of omnibus measure. The stickiest issue that they're dealing with, of course, is sequestration and how to lift the sequestration cap. The House raises funding significantly for defense. And the Senate bills have really largely stayed with the FY17 levels that were set, so they are also blowing through sequestration caps. So we anticipate that sequestration will be lifted, but we don't know to what level and what that will look like in the final deal. So there's, in the meantime as well, they started work on a budget resolution for FY18. As you probably can tell, they're really, really behind the 8 ball on this. But both the House and the Senate are considering their budget resolutions. And that is very important because those resolutions are going to be the vehicles for tax reform. They are going to try to use a process called reconciliation, which will only require them to have 50 votes in order to pass tax reform. But critical to that process is having a budget resolution out and passed. So both the Senate and the House are now dealing with that. I'll skip over just to tax reform, just to talk about that, since that's really the hot topic here right now. Congress has been just a huge priority for Republicans, and of course, in the wake of yet another healthcare repeal failure as perceived by Republicans, success as perceived by many Democrats, but in the wake of that, tax reform has become kind of the #1 priority. so you saw the White House, the administration, and Congress unveiled a draft of their tax overhaul plan, which has a number of major tax cuts involved. I think one of the things that we want to flag that is very, very concerning to a number of local governments is a proposal to repeal the state and local tax deduction. While it was not explicit, well, it has not been explicitly mentioned, they do mention eliminating the majority of deductions, and we know from conversations that this has been one that they are eyeing because, in their view, it's a very expensive one. And so I think it's 1.3 trillion over 10 years that they could raise in revenue. They also think that this is very attractive because for a number of Republicans, they perceive that this tax, this deduction purely benefits states like California and New York, which are, of course, primarily blue. And so it's a little bit of a political maneuver as well. That said, the entire New York Republican delegation has come out against this proposal. We have been actively working with California Republicans as well to ensure that they understand how this program would impact their district. But it is a huge problem if this was on the table. And just to flag, for example, for Congressman Correa's district, which has most of the city, 37% of individuals use the SALT program to the tune of a $6,752 average taxpayer deduction. So significant amounts of money here that we're talking about, and a significant portion of individuals. And so I want to make sure that that is on your radar as tax reform continues. The Republicans have laid out an extremely ambitious timeline trying to get tax reform through by the end of the year. Given how other events have happened, that seems somewhat dubious, but they are pushing forward on this very, very hard.
So let me just add a couple of things. Picking off on the last tax reform. Even though California is a blue state, the Republican is concerned because when you look at those numbers, a couple of those, quite a few members are in swing districts, and so they are considered either toss-ups or slight leans in terms of Republican voting patterns. And the loss of state and local tax deductibility can be quite significant. Some of those districts, it's up to 50% of the taxpayers in your district. So it's a very significant impact for those areas as well. And so even though New York and California are blue states, clearly Republican members are very much concerned about that. Just going back to the budget process. So on sequestration, what's interesting about that particular issue is very important because it's the way that the Democratic side of the aisle protects the non-defense discretionary programs, the domestic programs. Sequestration requires a sort of a balanced cut in both defense and non-defense discretionary. So if you're going to up the ante, as the Republicans have, in terms of defense, to the tune of, let's say, anywhere between $45 to $75 billion in new resources, then the impact on the domestic side is enormous unless you lift the sequestration. So we would suspect that maybe in December, but it could fall into the next year, as some of these omnibus agreements do, that we're going to see some kind of final budget agreement. And unfortunately, that this is not one of those reconciliation pieces of legislation that doesn't require 60 votes. This one would require 60 votes in order to lift the Budget Control Act sequestration requirement. So fortunately, the Democrats on the Senate side will have a lot to say about what that final agreement looks like. Again, working with House Democrats, but it's the Senate Democrats that will control the final outcome. So I think that's important, and so it's likely to have some bipartisan aspects to it. And that kind of leads into the other part of this, which is what happens to the wall and what happens to DACA. So there's a lot of play that's going to be going on in December. In the case of DACA, because of the 6-month extension that the president gave to any enforcement action, it could take us into March, but I think there is some effort to try to resolve this before the end of the year, at least on the bipartisan basis. But there's some pushback that's going on from the conservative wing of the party, so we have to kind of wait and see on that as well. Do you have anything to add on that? And lastly, I think in terms of our transportation project, again, that would be settled by any final agreement that is reached, any appropriations agreement that the House and Senate arrive at on a bipartisan basis. But we have to wait till December to see whether they're going to be able to reach that agreement by that time, or whether they push it off into the spring or early spring of next year. But I do think that we are in good shape right now with regard to to our New Starts program and the funding of this streetcar, particularly because of the very strong support that we have on the Senate side through Senator Feinstein's efforts on transportation appropriations.
Great. Thank you both. And let me bring it back to the council member. Any questions? None. So anything on the the punitive nature of the administration on cities that have declared themselves sanctuary cities? Anything to update us there, or is it fair? Or is it right now just being challenged in the courts, and that's kind of where it's at?
I think it's primarily on the court side of the fence on this. I think because of some of the disaster issues like with Houston, that there's been some kind of step back not to get to an enforcement side on this for now. But I do think that we're going to start seeing some effort, especially if you get into border security funding issues and the desire on the Trump administration and Republicans to put a lot of money into interior enforcement. That's where you start getting into these confrontations between sanctuary cities, safe cities, and administration.
Great. And I know that at the last meeting we talked about having some discussion about pending grants, timelines for those grants, and I know I was just advised by staff that we're going to delay that for a bit and present that, I believe, sometime later this year, like in November, right?
That's correct. We'll have the final numbers from our CFA for the previous fiscal year, and those numbers should be ready and presented to the City Council in November.
Great. Thank you, Jorge. So that takes care of that, Dan and Leslie. And, I know, Leslie, there's been a lot of talk about drones these days. And so I know we had that conversation a while back. So maybe at the next meeting you give us an update on where some of the federal legislation is on that and some of the new proposals that were being discussed.
Great, we'd be happy to.
Great. Thank you both.
Thank you.
All right. So why don't we go back to number 1, and I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
Dan and Leslie.
So moved.
Second.
Now exiting.
So those are adopted, and moving on now to number 2, which are the bylaws and the adjustment to include communication to the domain of this committee.
Thank you, committee members. Before you is an item in response to our last council meeting where we adopted revised bylaws. There was consideration to come back to this committee to include a communication section. So what we did is we made some recommended language adjustments to the committee bylaws that would essentially provide the council committee the opportunity to recommend policies, protocols, and strategies to effectively communicate city messaging. Those would be internal communications, but predominantly external. So how we communicate with our residents, our business owners, and the media. So we have those here. We have the clean version and the red line. If the council committee is agreeable to the language, then we would subsequently come to the city council as a receive and file for the full council to formally adopt.
Great, thanks. Any comments? Yeah, so I guess because the only question I had, I saw different colors. You're saying that the bylaws were already being modified?
Correct. When we merged the ethics council committee and the legislative, what we wanted to show was all of the changes that happened this year. So the changes that are in this purplish color, those are the ones related to communication. All the other changes were the previous changes that were adopted.
So should we put something in here saying we can't incorporate in any other areas so our name and title doesn't get bigger?
We will find a great acronym. We can guarantee you that.
Man, that's a pretty long one. Well, we can do some work, but I don't know how much more we can cover. And on that note, I know that our communications director, sent out some messaging to all of us, advising us that she will be leaving us. So I hope we didn't scare you away by wanting to have some coverage. That's it. It's the last straw.
No mas.
It's the last straw.
Absolutely not. It's been a pleasure to work here with the city of Santa Ana for over 17 years. I've had a tremendous career, very fortunate, and now looking to focus on my family and raising my child. So thank you all for the trust and guidance and support you've given me throughout the years.
Well, we're going to miss you, and hopefully you're going to continue to keep in touch with us, and I'm sure Tony's going to keep on visiting us.
Absolutely.
And you can,
We may bring you back.
yeah.
Yeah,
You're welcome back.
You never leave Santa Ana, and that's very true. I find that of almost all of our employees. There's just such a special place for us in our heart for this great city.
Well, I'm sure we're going to be able to say our goodbyes later as well, but, I just want to say on the experience I've had with you working both, in your capacity as city manager staff and now as a communications director, it's been a pleasure, and we certainly are going to miss you, but we wish you well. I know that my wife took a few years off to be with our kids when they were young, and it's invaluable, and she doesn't regret a moment of that. So, kudos to you, and thank you for that. So with that, do we need to move this item?
Yes.
Okay. So I'll entertain a motion. So adopted by both of us. I'm sure Councilman Tinajero will be in agreement with that, so that motion is approved. Moving along to, and I know we have a request to speak from the public, so before TPA presents, Gilad, why don't you go ahead and address us?
I'm a resident of Santa Ana. I'm also the vice chair of the ETAC Commission, which deals with environment and transportation. And so I just wanted to make sure that we keep an eye on SB 231. It's currently before the governor's, it's waiting for the governor's signature, but it's essentially to label sewers as part of stormwater management, or stormwater management as part of sewers, and so that we'd be able to use our stormwater management practices and charge for those as part of our sewage fees. And that's particularly important for folks like ETAC who care about trees, because there's a lot of stormwater management solutions that also would go to ensuring that our trees are properly watered. One solution is the Silva cell, which allows for storage of stormwater at tree wells, so that the investments we make in trees actually grow over time, so that instead of having to replace a tree after 15 years, after 20 years, you end up with a mature tree. And as you all know, like trees, it's one of the few city investments that actually appreciates in value over time, right? Because you spend the money to plant it, you spend money for maintenance, but when it really becomes important is when it's large and providing all the benefits that a large mature tree with large canopy provides. And so it's really important that we track SB 231 and make sure that we also tie that back to whatever we can do with stormwater management for our trees. And then the other piece I wanted to talk about was asking the League of California Cities to just talk with you guys, to share with you what banning outdoor cultivation of cannabis would do for our eligibility for grants. We need money in the city, we need grants. And one of the things that's been both on the cannabis ordinance that you second read last night, as well as the one that's coming up, is that banning outdoor cultivation would make us ineligible for the grants under the that come from the state excise tax, which is 15%. A League of California Cities primer dated from January of this year specifically says that if our city's at risk of losing does the city's ban on commercial cultivation, personal outdoor cultivation, or retail sales make it ineligible for state grant monies for law enforcement, fire protection, or other programs addressing public health and safety of Prop 64? And the answer is yes, and this is specifically from the league, and I really don't want our city to lose out on fire money, police money, youth grants for nonprofits, public health grants, and so the fact that that's in the proposed ordinance is really concerning that we're instantly making ourselves ineligible to even apply for those grants. So I appreciate the time.
Great, thank you, Gilad. Those are both good points, and I'm sure we'll have maybe both TPA and the league address those. So why don't we go ahead and hear from Townsend Public Affairs and Casey and Corey.
Casey Elliott with Townsend Public Affairs. I just want to provide an overview of kind of what's been going on in Sacramento. The legislature concluded their legislative session on September 15th, so we're in the month period where the governor's taking action on all of those measures that are still before him. Right now, there's still approximately 500 bills or so that the governor has to act on between now and October 15th. So we should start seeing actions come through in large chunks pretty much daily for the next 10, 11 days. As far as kind of looking back at the legislative session, I think most people consider it was a productive session. There was a lot of kind of big ticket items that have been on the legislative agenda for several years that were able to be addressed this year in some form or another. I think kind of just in no particular order, affordable housing. The governor just signed the affordable housing package that was done by the legislature. It was a package of 15 bills. There were three kind of main components that drove that package, the three being Senate Bill 2 by Ms. Atkins, which is the ongoing revenue source for affordable housing. That was the most contentious of the bills and the one that kind of needed the 2/3 vote to put the whole package over the top. Ultimately, that got done, and the funding was done in such a way that starting in 2019, 70% of that money will go to local governments based on CDBG formulas. So if we estimate that the state's going to get about $250 million in revenue, then the city of Santa Ana should get somewhere around a $2.6 million direct allocation out of that, which would be annual and ongoing. Obviously can fluctuate depending upon the economic cycle, but that will be there and ongoing. Second piece, SB 3 by Mr. Bell. That's a housing bond, $4 billion housing bond that'll go on in November. $1 billion of that is for veterans housing, and then the other $3 billion gets funded back into programs for kind of a broad range of affordable housing programs. Then the primary regulatory piece was SB 35. We've seen kind of versions of this bill over the last couple of years, but essentially it calls for the streamlining of infill projects if they meet certain zoning requirements and local governments are not meeting their RENA numbers. So that bill will likely be impactful for many local governments. The idea being that if the state's going to be providing money for affordable housing, that we need the local governments to be approving housing projects and getting those going. So between the 15 bills, there was something for everyone to like and something for everyone to dislike, which is probably why it happened. Ultimately, is that you just had enough for everyone to want to move forward. In addition to affordable housing, earlier in the year we had cap and trade extension was done. At the end of the session, the legislature approved their cap and trade expenditure plan for the current fiscal year. It was $1.5 billion, kind of spread over a number of programs. About $900 million of that goes into reducing air pollution through diesel truck retrofits, through car buybacks, through a number of programs. You have some money going to ag, some money going to renewable energy, so a lot of money getting spread around. The way they structured cap and trade, the $1.5 billion was just for the current fiscal year, so they'll need to be doing this at least annually, or at least one more time. We'll say that. They could always do a multi-year funding plan, but now that cap and trade, the program has been extended, there should be some more stability, so hopefully the dollar prices will be more similar to this $1.5 billion in spending for this fiscal year than it has been to previous fiscal years. And again, the legislature and administration pretty much have carte blanche in what they want to fund and how they want to fund it, as long as they can tie it back to greenhouse gas reductions. Other items to kind of briefly mention, SB 54 by Mr. De Leon, Sanctuary State. That bill was approved. The pro tem and the governor were negotiating at the end of session to come up with provisions that would be acceptable to the administration. They addressed some of law enforcement's concerns with the bill. It still didn't bring them on to support of the measure, but that bill did pass and it is expected to be signed by the governor, so that will be happening. One of the bills that we had talked about at our last meeting was Senate Bill 4 by Mr. Mendoza, dealing with the structure of the Cal Optima Board. That measure passed the legislature. We had conversations based on committee input last time with the author and his staff about seeking a dedicated seat on the board for the city. The senator's office received numerous requests of similar nature from different entities for a seat on the board. Ultimately, the way the politics worked and the way that the senator was going to be able to get the bill through was to maintain the existing Cal Optima board. However, intent language was put into the bill that would require the legislature, when it revisits the composition of the board, should mention the bill has a 5-year sunset, so it provides the legislature an opportunity that amongst the items that the legislature can and should look at would be the composition of the membership of Cal Optima, as well as the community representation by city, by ethnicity, so a bunch of different factors which should lay the groundwork for having the discussion about a dedicated seat for the city on the Cal Optima board.
But the bill was just for status quo, right?
The bill is just for status quo right now, and that was one of the things that they wanted to make sure that the bill maintained an urgency clause so that there weren't any additional actions at the Board of Supervisors level before the bill went in order to kind of navigate those 2/3 vote politics. They decided they needed to leave the existing structure the same, but throwing in the sunset so they could revisit it, and then some additional points that they would want future legislatures to look at. Should note that the 5-year sunset, the legislature can still act to revisit the Cal Optima board, the composition, anytime in advance of those 5 years. And then two other, well, I'll talk about a quick one, then I'll let Corey speak real briefly. SB 649 by Mr. Huesa, the small cell bill. That measure did move through the legislature. It's currently pending before the administration. We worked with a large coalition, including many of the league and many of other cities, to try to drum up as much opposition as possible to that bill within the legislature. I've also been actively working with the governor's office to try to provide them some groundwork for reasoning for a veto. I anticipate that the governor will probably take until until the 15th before he acts on that bill. I think it's probably one of the more controversial bills that's down in front of him. So last discussions we've had, the governor hadn't made up his mind. He hadn't committed one way or the other. But again, I think a lot of people are providing good data to provide as a basis or a veto of that measure. And then I'll let Corey talk about the park bond as well.
So the final big ticket item was the proposed park bond, which, as you know, we've been talking about for almost 2 years now. And like most things in Sacramento, came down to the final week of the legislative session. Ultimately, a $4 billion parks bond was approved by the legislature. It is currently on the governor's desk. It included about $1.5 billion for water funding, which was a significant priority of Senate Pro Tem De Leon, which left $2.5 billion for parks funding. 3 significant pots for the city of Santa Ana. There's $725 million for parks in park poor neighborhoods. $120 million that will be given out on a per capita basis for cities and park districts. And Department of Finance will be looking at the latest census tracts to determine exactly what those numbers look like. But there's a minimum of $200,000 guaranteed for every city across the state. We obviously expect Santa Ana to receive more than that based on your numbers. And then finally, probably the pot you're most familiar with based on our work over the last 2 years is funding for the Santa Ana River Conservancy Program. In last year's version of the Parks Bond, we had about $3.5 million in that program. We were able to increase that through the final negotiations to $16 million. So there will be $16 million for the Santa Ana River Conservancy. It will likely be consistent with the Santa Ana River Conservancy Program plan that has been developed by that group. The bond will be once it's signed by the governor, we do expect him to sign it. It will be on a June 2018 ballot to be approved by the voters.
Great. Can you both speak to the comments that were made by the speaker, both on SB 231 and also on the cannabis and the outdoor cultivation eligibility for?
Sure. Yeah.
funds?
I'll maybe take the last one first. Based on our conversations with the Bureau and with Secretary Podesta, our understanding is that local governments that will not be eligible for grants if they do a complete ban of cultivation. So if it's just an outdoor cultivation with indoor still permitted, then they would maintain grant eligibility. It's our understanding. Obviously, we can double check back with agency, but at this point, that's the understanding that we have. They're also obviously working on setting up kind of their final set of regulations to have temporary permits in place on January 2nd. So there'll probably be a 6-month period, but while there's still temporary permitting going on before the state's kind of fully up and running.
And just to get back on that, I'm not sure what ours is. Ours silent to the outdoor, or is it a strict ban on the outdoor? At least the proposed from what we have in draft.
Sure. So the proposed will include an opportunity to allow indoor cultivation,
I'm talking about
but not outdoor.
Without outdoor.
Correct.
Okay. Yeah, because it just doesn't seem to make sense. There are communities in the state that are very, densely populated like ours that are kind of, grown out and built out, and so you're almost being punitive on those. So that's good. I mean, your analysis makes more sense. But, Councilman?
No, just I agree with that, as well as all these grant programs, they evolve, and I think you're going to see a number of tweaks to this grant program and others, and we just got to make sure to avoid having things in our ordinance that are going to be overly problematic with what we want. But I think in this case, because we are so densely populated, we don't really have ag land, I don't know that it makes a lot of sense to have outdoor cultivation. So I think we're in good shape so far, but let's keep watching.
Definitely. Yeah, and I think to your point, I think there will definitely be lots of legislation and modifications to grant programs and guidelines going forward over the next several years.
Did you have a question, Vila?
Just to be very clear, like it was the personal outdoor cultivation part, which is both outlawed in the city currently and is included in the proposed ordinance. We can't touch indoor cultivation. That's a statewide thing that's approved in every single city in both single residential and multi-unit. So everyone will be allowed to have 6 plants indoors in all our apartment buildings across the city. So I'm not suggesting we approve giant ag lands. I'm just concerned about the personal outdoor cultivation and that as it relates to the grants. It's very comforting to hear that that might not be included, but I was just going off the California League of Cities primer, so I'm curious. So I just want to be clear, it's the personal outdoor cultivation of a small number of plants that I'm concerned about making us ineligible.
And to that point, and to the councilman's point, as we're going through these drafts, are we checking in with our state folks to make sure that anything in our draft language isn't going to be, again, detrimental to us for future funds, even though it, the language on these things are, evolve almost weekly. But, that would be just one suggestion, that we just continue checking in. And then Casey, I think the other question that Gilad has was on SB 231. I think that's Hertzberg's bill, and I'm not sure if we even took a position on that one.
I don't believe the city took a position. You're correct. It's Senator Hertzberg's bill. It's been about a 2-year effort with a lot of stakeholders, and the League of Cities has been closely involved. It basically will ensure that stormwater is treated under Proposition 213 the same way as trash, household water, or sewer, to allow local governments, if they choose, to charge fees to finance projects that capture stormwater. It is on the governor's desk. He has not taken a position yet.
Got it. Councilman, anything further for the Sacramento team?
Yeah, just on that cell site item, I know that there was some interest by AT&T maybe to disallow those contracts for companies like 5 Bars to do whatever they claim they could do. Is there any update on whether they did make that change to that bill?
Yeah, they put in...
Or the window to do that, and I know we're kind of having just a generic conversation on do we even consider something like that or not?
Yeah, they put in, and I don't have the language right in front of you. There was a sentence put into 649 in one of the last rounds of amendments that essentially still gave flexibility to entities that had contracts with companies like 5 Bars. So they did not, they kind of worked around that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. And then I think there might have been some discussion too of if there are cell sites like at parks and certain city-owned premises that we could have more of a say in land use stuff and fees.
Yeah, there's some language that provides flexibility for cultural and historical and districts, things along those. So there's some flexibility.
Mm-hmm.
I think that overall a lot of the city and the league opposite, I won't speak for Tony, but obviously the local control issue, the fund, the limiting on the ability to collect market rate. Still were some of those underlying concerns that weren't quite there, but there was some concession made to try to take some of those things into account in the final version of the bill.
Collectively, to all these things balance out, I mean, it sounds like we're going to lose all this money, but guess where that money comes from consumers, and so we'll have cell phone bills ourselves, including as cities. So do we really want to see, these higher cell phone personal bills or city bills so that the city can get an extra, $400 per site or something?
I think the one thing I would say is that if 649 is vetoed this year, I have no doubt that we will see a version of it back next year. I think that it would definitely be good for all cities to be probably more engaged in that conversation of how can we be proactive to work with industry, because over the long haul, that's just probably a battle that's not winnable. Because I think that there are a lot of compelling arguments that the proponents have, and maybe just the rollout of that could be more done as a smart city or just having more partnership and involvement. Because like I said, I think that if 649 is vetoed, I would anticipate that bill will be back next year.
Got it. Any last words on 231? Anything that you said it's before the governor now?
Correct. It's on his desk.
Any value with us doing anything or taking a position? Tony, or you want to speak on that? We'll take you out of order. Any opinion on that?
Yeah, I'll just touch on it real quick. SB 231, we did ultimately take a support position on the bill. So the league does have a support position. It did address a California Supreme Court decision, so it kind of goes around that decision. But ultimately, the league took a support, and we're asking the governor to support it.
So I'm not sure if it's before him, maybe not a lot to do. He's going to be considering it.
Yeah. If we wanted to take a support position, there'd be, I don't think there'd be any issue with that. It's just the timing, probably need to get that letter in
This week.
Any appetite for that from staff or from the committee?
Probably no downside. I mean, there may be some benefits to the city.
Yeah.
Even if it's just a paragraph or two.
So it sounds like we have a consensus to maybe have staff send something up. Couldn't hurt. I agree. Thank you, and thank you for those comments, Gila.
I will email your staff our support letter.
Great. Appreciate it. Thank you, Tony. And is that it, Casey and Corey? Anything else? Anything further, Councilman?
I don't know if Tony has anything yet.
Well, he does. He's next on the
okay,
agenda,
okay,
so
okay.
we'll go ahead and so thank you both. And Tony, the floor is yours on number 5.
Sure, thank you. And I'll just touch the public question on the cannabis issue. We did release that primer. Our understanding is that if a city limits any form of cultivation outdoors, that a city won't be eligible for those grants. I understand that attorneys for the industry are saying the same, but it's ultimately to the Bureau of Cannabis Control to kind of clarify that. So I just kind of wanted to reaffirm that we at least that we did put that information out, that the city must allow the full spectrum of cultivation in order to be eligible to receive those grants. So I just wanted to start with that. I don't know if you have any follow-up questions on that. I can resend the primer out that the individual spoke to.
Yeah, I think that's clear. I think so.
Okay. And yeah, on SB 649, that is our number one priority right now. We are asking for the governor to veto the bill. AT&T did include some amendments in there. We just didn't feel like it went far enough on the revenue aspect that Casey mentioned, certainly on the land use. And in terms of positive news, some labor groups have come out in opposition to it. The Department of Finance has spoken in opposition to it, but the governor has kept his cards very close to the chest. We don't know what he's going to do with the bill, but we're encouraging him to veto the bill. Item 2 is the housing package that was signed by the governor. The report that I provided to the committee has the full spectrum of bills that were signed as a part of that package. There were 3 bills, main bills, but as you can see, there's a full spectrum here of bills, everything from enforcement to funding that's provided. We did oppose some, those that chipped away at your local land use authority. We supported the majority. I mean, note that the legislature is starting to chip away at your local land use authority through SB 35. We did ask for a veto of that bill, but that bill was ultimately signed. NIMBY cities here in Orange County, that's going to be a big reality check for them. But cities like yourselves that are doing good, it could also impact you all as well. The league, we are writing an analysis on the entire funding package. That'll be released out in a couple weeks. So in terms of impacts to cities. So we'll get that out to you. But in terms of SB 35, see it as a pilot program. It's going to be in place for 8 years. But will the state let go of that power after those 8 years? Well, we don't know. The legislature also said, even though there's a full package of bills here, they said we're just getting started on affordable housing. So what does that mean for next year? We don't know. We hear that it's going to go to address the costs of creating moderate to low income housing. How do you reduce the cost for developers and make it attractive? So that may be kind of where they're going to go with the housing next year.
So is 35 based on RENA numbers? Isn't that what?
It's based on RENA numbers.
And
yes.
that was just something I wasn't sure. Where are we on our RENA numbers? I always thought that we were fairly. I mean, we're not close to what the target is, but we're much further along than others. I think, to Tony's point. Right?
And we are. The city has been doing great. Unfortunately, it's not just the city. So looking at it in the county and in our area, that's where we have some issues. So we're essentially tied to the lack of affordable housing that others around us aren't achieving.
So maybe it'll motivate our friends.
Maybe, absolutely. And it certainly will create that motivation. And I would say that some cities do need that motivation.
We certainly tried to motivate him, and for maybe it has to come from Sacramento, right? So.
But that will be the reality check, and we'll see how much of a hammer that's used as a hammer to motivate some cities. The last item I wanted to touch on is SB1, the transportation revenues that are now going to be available to cities come January 1. Cities in Orange County are amending their budgets to be able to tap into those dollars come January 1. But there's a lot of politics in play. There are signatures that are being collected right now on a statutory ballot measure. They only need 5% of eligible voters. They only need 5%, so the bar is very low. The deadline to submit those signatures is going to be in early January. So we're going to know if the repeal of SB1 is going to be before the voters come November of next year. The League, along with our transportation coalition partners, we are authoring a ballot measure for June. That's going to ask the voters to, look, the legislature authorizes this new pot of money, let's protect it and make sure it goes to transportation. That's going to be a relatively easy message to give to the voters, and I would expect that ballot measure to pass. The real battle is going to come in November. Republicans haven't had a win in a very, very long time. They're going to want to use this as a win. Our own Assemblymember Travis Allen is running for governor, and he's using this certainly as a platform, and he's getting a lot of notoriety for this on the repeal of SB1. That, if it's qualified, that's going to go before the voters in November. I just read a polling by Probowski that just came out this morning, 35% support for SB1 and 58 opposed. So it's going to be a bloodbath. There's going to be blood, and that'll come in November. And the League is going to be defending SB1 with their coalition partners. So it's going to be very, very interesting to see what happens.
That 35% is
It's abysmal.
pre-campaign, right?
Pre-campaign, that's correct.
Yeah, so,
Yeah.
yeah, you're right. It's going to be messy. So thank you for that, Tony. Before we leave, that, and I think go on to our last item, just to get back to this whole thing with and I know the council member's been working hard on the whole draft and proposal on the cannabis issue. We keep hearing the end of the year something has to be done, and cities have to submit or identify licenses so those operators can be eligible for their state permits. Any movement on that date being pushed back, or is it still a firm date? Because it just seems like it's a mad scramble for everybody, right?
Yeah, I mean, based on our conversations with agency and department and the bureau, it sounds like they're holding to the January 2 for temporary licenses. That said, it seems like there's a lot of flexibility in what they will accept for a temporary license. I mean, letters, resolutions. I mean, it doesn't sound like it's. I mean, it's so. I think they're holding firm to the date, but I think what's acceptable and what meets the date, there's a lot of flexibility.
Because the
on that.
language is so ambiguous. It says operating. Boy, you just,
Operational
and so
status.
I don't know what that. I mean, look, that's lawyer talk, and you can right, kind of fill in the blank. But I guess for us, I just wanted to make sure that our approach is not going to be undermined.
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, in all the conversations that we've had, it seems like agency is definitely going to be deferential to local governments and what's going on, particularly for the January deadline. So I don't think that they want to be in a position on January where they're deciding yes or no on.
Can you
on
be
permits.
in progress? I mean, can a city be in progress in their pursuit of determining those operators?
I would think that the state will be flexible and work with the city in what you want to
I mean,
do.
that's a stretch, but it just seems like there may be some caught in the middle.
I would assume so. I think that the whole first 6 month period of temporary permits is probably going to be the state's going to be pretty flexible and willing to work with folks. And then, so to your point, I think that probably the real deadline is probably closer to July, but they are going to have something in place for January.
I was just going to say, we heard a rumor that businesses must be up and running by December 15th in order to be in the first round of state licenses. We don't know if that's true or not.
Boy, that seems really rigid. But okay, well, good to know. Keep us posted if something changes or if something is more concrete. Moving on to our last item, that's number 6. That's the report card on our bills. And Jorge, I think that's yours.
Yes, new this year, one of the things that we wanted to do is to provide the committee and ultimately the city council with a report card of sorts for all of the items that we took positions. Exactly. How good did we do? We try to bat 1,000.
Our lobbying firms too.
Exactly. This will be one of those things to help us out, right? So we put this together, and it outlines all of the positions that we've taken on various items, most of them in alignment with the legislative platform, some that the City Council has taken positions on. Ultimately, what we're most interested in is that outcome. So we have provided the information. As you'll see, a couple of them were amended to completely different bills, different titles, and many of them right now are awaiting signature from the governor, especially the state bills. So this is something that we'll be working on and tracking as we go forward. And then this will be something that, as we're putting together the legislative platform, if there are items where we weren't successful, but the committee and the city council wants to take a more aggressive position or provide more direction to staff, this will help us with putting together a more robust legislative platform moving forward.
It's helpful. Questions, comments? And maybe this is a good sort of matrix or model to use for our grants, moving forward. Maybe we can see some, where we've been successful with some of our grants. I know we always compete well when we do joint grants with the school district or other agencies, and that might be helpful as well. And maybe we put the numerical amount, how much we've been able to garner and what's still out there and what we might be looking towards. But this is helpful. Thank you.
Great suggestion. We'll do that.
Any committee comments? Staff comments? And I guess we're adjourned till the next meeting in January, or to be determined. Thank you all.